The convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas, Valladolid, on Good Friday night, April 12, 1555. In the dim light of an austere room, more like a cell than a royal chamber, a 75-year-old woman, consumed by almost half a century of cruel and unjustified confinement, breathes her last weary breath. She is Juana of Castile, daughter of the Catholic monarchs, sister of Catherine of Aragon, wife of Philip the Handsome, mother of 2 emperors and 4 queens, and, in history and legend, Juana la Loca, Juana the Mad. Her death, in the solitude and oblivion of that convent prison, brings to an end one of the most tragic and enigmatic lives in European royalty, an existence marked by an obsessive love that defied death, by supposed madness that served as a pretext to strip her of her crown, and by a ruthless confinement that turned her into a wandering shadow, clinging to the memory and unburied corpse of her unfaithful but beloved husband. Was Juana really insane, the victim of a hereditary defect or unbearable pain? Or was her madness a convenient invention, a cruel label imposed by the men of her own blood, her father, her husband, her son, to annul her politically and seize her vast kingdoms? And was her macabre pilgrimage with the coffin of Philip the Handsome the manifestation of a disturbed mind or a desperate act to assert her legitimacy as Queen Dowager and Regent? The story of Juana la Loca is a labyrinth of overflowing passions, unscrupulous political ambitions, and human suffering that shakes the soul. This is the chronicle of a queen who loved too much, who perhaps went mad with grief, and who paid with almost 50 years of confinement the price of being a woman, a queen, and an heiress in a world dominated by men. Join me as I unravel the secrets of Tordesillas, explore the torments of Juana's heart, and try to discern the truth behind the legend of the queen who refused to bury her husband. Was she a martyr of love, a victim of reason of state, or simply a fragile mind broken by tragedy? The mystery of Juana la Loca, like the smell of incense and death that permeated her cell, continues to linger in the air of history, challenging our certainties and stirring our compassion. To understand in all her depth and tragic complexity the figure of Juana of Castile, known to history and legend as La Loca, the Mad, and to understand the circumstances that led her to such a lonely and unhappy end after almost half a century of confinement, it is absolutely essential that we first immerse ourselves with due attention to historical detail and the turbulent political, social, and religious context in the Spain of the late 15th and early 16th centuries. We find ourselves in a time of profound and rapid change, a period of transition between the Middle Ages and the modern age, marked by the end of the Reconquista, the discovery of a new world, the consolidation of authoritarian monarchy, and growing religious tensions that heralded the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Juana was born in the city of Toledo on November 6, 1479, into the powerful Trastamara dynasty, which ruled both Castile and Aragon. She was the 3rd child and 2nd daughter of the Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, the monarchs who, through their marriage and astute politics, had achieved the dynastic union of the 2 most important kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula, and laid the foundations for the future configuration of Spain as one of the great powers of Europe and the world. Her birth came at a time of great hope and intense challenges for her parents. The War of Granada, the final phase of the Reconquista, was in full swing, and the religious unity of the peninsula, through the expulsion of the Jews and the forced conversion of the Muslims, was one of the main political objectives of the Catholic monarchs. In this atmosphere of religious fervor, warlike exaltation, and consolidation of royal power, the young Infanta Juana received a careful and exceptionally complete education for a woman of her time, although it was always geared toward her future role as a key player in the complex network of marriage alliances that her parents were weaving with the leading royal houses of Europe. Her mother, Queen Isabella, a woman of remarkable intelligence, deep religious faith, and a strong and determined character, personally supervised her education. Juana learned Latin, French, music. She could play the harpsichord and the monochord, dance, embroidery, and of course the fundamentals of the Catholic faith and court etiquette. However, unlike her mother, who possessed extraordinary emotional balance and strength of character, Juana showed signs from an early age of a sensitive, passionate, melancholic personality prone to emotional extremes. Some chroniclers of the time already pointed to a certain weakness of understanding or a melancholic disposition, inherited perhaps from her maternal grandmother Isabel of Portugal, who, it is said, also suffered episodes of mental derangement in her later years. These supposed hereditary defects, magnified or minimized according to the interests of each individual, would later be used to justify her incapacitation and long confinement. Juana's childhood and adolescence were spent in a nomadic environment, following the court of the Catholic monarchs on their constant travels through Castile and Aragon, and witnessing firsthand the great events of her time: the conquest of Granada, the discovery of America, and the wars in Italy. She was educated alongside her siblings: Isabella, the eldest, destined to be Queen of Portugal; John, the crown prince, in whom all the hopes of the dynasty were pinned, but who died prematurely; Mary, who would also marry the King of Portugal after the death of her sister Isabella; and Catherine, the youngest, future and unhappy wife of Henry VIII of England and mother of Mary Tudor. Among her tutors were figures such as Beatriz Galindo, La Latina, one of the most educated women of her time, and the Dominican friar Andrés de Miranda, her confessor. Despite this careful education and her undeniable intelligence and culture, Juana always showed a certain inner rebelliousness, a difficulty in submitting to the rigid rules of the court, and a tendency toward introspection and sadness that worried her parents. In 1496, when she was only 16, Juana was sent to Flanders to marry Archduke Philip of Austria, nicknamed the Handsome for his physical appearance. Philip was the son of Emperor Maximilian the Huron of Habsburg and Mary of Burgundy, and heir to a vast and wealthy conglomerate of territories that included the Netherlands, the Franche-Comté, and the Austrian possessions of the Habsburgs. This marriage, arranged by the Catholic monarchs for purely political reasons, to isolate France, their main rival in Europe, and secure a powerful alliance with the German Empire, would tragically and irreversibly mark Juana's destiny. From the moment she first saw her fiancé, a handsome, athletic young blonde with a taste for pleasure, Juana fell in love with him with a passionate, almost obsessive devotion that bordered on idolatry. Philip, on the other hand, although he initially seemed to reciprocate his young wife's affections, soon proved to be a frivolous, fickle, womanizing man who was much more interested in politics and the pleasures of the Burgundian court than in Joan's feelings. The relationship between the two was marked from the beginning by Juana's unhealthy jealousy, caused by Felipe's constant infidelities and disdain, and by the young princess's scenes of hysteria and despair, as she could not bear her husband's indifference and humiliations. Despite these marital tensions, the marriage was fertile and produced 6 children, all of whom would go on to occupy important thrones in Europe: Leonor, future Queen of Portugal and France; Carlos, the future Emperor Carlos V, Carlos III of Spain; Isabel, future Queen of Denmark; Fernando, future Emperor Fernando Bermest; Maria, future Queen of Hungary and Bohemia; and Catalina, future Queen of Portugal. The premature death of her older siblings, Prince John in 1497, and Princess Isabella and her son Michael in the following years, unexpectedly made Joanna the heir to the crowns of Castile and Aragon. This momentous event completely altered her position and that of her husband Philip, and triggered a complex and often ruthless power struggle that would have fatal consequences for her. In 1502, Juana and Philip traveled to Spain to be sworn in as heirs by the Cortes of Castile and Aragon. However, Philip, unaccustomed to the austerity of the Castilian court and eager to return to his domains in Flanders, abandoned Juana in Spain, pregnant with their 4th child, Ferdinand. This forced separation plunged Juana into a deep depression and exacerbated her erratic behavior. Finally, in 1504, Juana was able to reunite with Philip in Flanders, but their relationship was already irreparably damaged. That same year in November, Queen Isabella the Catholic died, leaving Juana as Queen of Castile and her father, Ferdinand the Catholic, as regent in her absence or incapacity. Thus began the most turbulent and tragic period of Juana's life, a period in which she would be caught between the ambitions of her father and those of her husband, and in which her supposed madness would become the main argument for stripping her of her power and freedom. The omens of a lonely and unhappy end were already looming over the young queen, whose only true desire seemed to be the love of a man who did not love her and control over a destiny that others were determined to take away from her. A new enigma, that of the exact nature of her mental illness, began to weave itself around her, an enigma that would accompany her to the grave and beyond. And a symbolic object, the coffin of her beloved Philip, would become, after his premature death, the center of her obsession and the emblem of her tragic and wandering madness. The downward spiral that would plunge Juana of Castile into an abyss of pain, supposed madness and confinement that would last almost half a century accelerated dramatically after the death of her mother, Queen Isabella the Catholic, in November 1504. As heir to the throne of Castile, Juana became overnight a key player in the complex political chess game of the Iberian Peninsula and Europe, but also the object of the conflicting ambitions of the two most important men in her life, her father, Ferdinand the Catholic, and her husband, Philip the Handsome. The will of Isabella the Catholic, although it named Juana as Queen of Castile, also established that her father, Ferdinand, would act as regent of the kingdom in the event of Juana's absence, or if she did not wish or was unable to govern them. This ambiguous clause, which veiled allusion to Juana's emotional instability, was the source of an immediate and bitter conflict between Fernando and Felipe for effective control of power in Castile. Fernando, an astute and experienced politician, was not willing to relinquish the government of the most important kingdom on the peninsula, which he had helped to forge. Arguing that his daughter was incapable of ruling, he tried by every means to prolong his regency and keep Philip away from power. Philip, for his part, supported by a significant portion of the Castilian high nobility, who saw in him an opportunity to free themselves from Ferdinand's iron grip and increase their own influence, and by his Flemish advisers, eager to gain access to the riches and positions of Castile, vehemently claimed the right to rule on behalf of his wife, the legitimate queen. In the midst of this power struggle, Juana became a puppet, a victim whose will and feelings hardly mattered. Her obsessive love for Felipe, despite his constant infidelities and disdain, led her to initially support her husband's claims against those of her father. In 1506, Philip and Joanna landed in Castile from Flanders, ready to take over the government. Tension with Ferdinand the Catholic was at its height, and civil war was even feared. Finally, in the Concordia de Villafafula, June 1506, Ferdinand, feeling at a disadvantage, agreed to retire to his kingdoms of Aragon, leaving the government of Castile in the hands of Philip and Juana. However, the astute Aragonese king made sure to include clauses that would allow him to intervene if Juana's illness worsened, and he did not give up his intrigues to discredit his son-in-law and prepare his return to power. Philip the Handsome's brief reign in Castile, which lasted only a few months, was marked by inexperience, the arrogance of his Flemish advisers, who aroused the hostility of the Castilians, and above all, by the worsening of his marital problems with Joanna. The queen's jealousy, fueled by Philip's continuous love affairs and her own emotional insecurity, manifested itself in increasingly scandalous and violent public scenes. It is said that Joanna even physically assaulted some of her husband's mistresses and spent her nights awake, crying and spying on Philip, plunged into permanent anguish and mistrust. Philip, far from showing understanding or affection towards his wife, reacted cruelly, humiliating her, isolating her, and even locking her in her chambers. This untenable situation, coupled with the growing unpopularity of Philip and his Flemish government, created a climate of instability and discontent in Castile. Then, suddenly and unexpectedly, tragedy struck again. In September 1506, barely 3 months after taking power in Castile, Philip the Handsome, who had appeared to be in robust health, fell seriously ill in Burgos after playing a vigorous game of pelota and drinking cold water. His illness, a high and persistent fever accompanied by sharp pains, progressed with alarming speed, and within a few days, on September 25th, Philip the Handsome died at the age of 28. Philip's death, so premature and so convenient for his father-in-law Ferdinand the Catholic, who was in Naples at the time but would soon return to Castile to take over the regency, immediately sparked a wave of rumors and suspicions of poisoning. Although the official version spoke of a fleeting fever or plague, probably pneumonia or pleurisy, many contemporaries and numerous later historians have speculated that it was a political assassination orchestrated by Ferdinand or one of his agents. However, no conclusive evidence of such a crime was ever found, and the exact cause of Philip's death remains a matter of debate. This internal hook, the mysterious death of Philip, is crucial, as it triggers the darkest phase of Juana's life. The partial revelation of her father's possible involvement adds a layer of tragedy and betrayal. For Juana, Philip's death was a devastating blow, the final collapse of her already fragile emotional balance. Her grief turned into a macabre obsession, a refusal to part with her husband's corpse, an increasingly erratic and extravagant behavior that would confirm, in the eyes of many, her supposed madness. She refused to allow Felipe's body to be buried in Burgos and decided to personally transfer it to Granada, where, according to her mother's will, the kings of Castile were to rest. Thus began Juana's famous and grim pilgrimage with her husband's coffin, a wandering journey through the roads of Castile that would last months and become the most emblematic and controversial episode of her legend. During this macabre funeral procession, which was preferably carried out at night to avoid the heat and prying eyes, and in which the presence of other women was strictly forbidden, for fear that they might arouse the queen's jealousy even after Felipe's death, Juana frequently ordered the coffin to be opened so that she could gaze upon her husband's embalmed face, to kiss him and talk to him, in a display of necrophilic love that both horrified and moved her entourage in equal measure. Her increasingly strange and isolated behavior fueled the reports that her father, Ferdinand the Catholic, received in Aragon, which he used to justify the need for his own intervention in Castile. Juana's downward spiral accelerated, and her final confinement drew inexorably closer. Despair, paranoia, and a profound denial of reality took hold of her, turning her into a shadow of the queen she could have been. In Juana de Castilla's case, the shadow of the executioner did not take the form of an axe or a stake, but rather that of prolonged, cruel, and progressively isolating confinement, a psychological torment that lasted for almost 5 decades and slowly consumed her in solitude and oblivion. After the macabre and wandering pilgrimage with the coffin of her husband Philip the Handsome through the lands of Castile, an episode that lasted several months and definitively cemented her reputation as mad, Juana was finally confined, by order of her father, Ferdinand the Catholic, to the austere and isolated royal palace of Tordesillas, a fortress convent located on the banks of the Duero River in the heart of Castile. It was 1509, and Juana was then 30 years old. She would not leave Tordesillas alive until her death, 46 years later. The deterioration of her mental state, or at least her ability to cope with the demands of the outside world and political intrigues, became increasingly evident during her confinement in Tordesillas. Although she remained the legal queen of Castile, and her vast kingdoms were ruled in her name, first by her father Ferdinand, and then by her son Charles, Juana was gradually removed from any kind of political decision-making or contact with the outside world. Her confinement, although formally justified by her alleged mental incapacity, also had obvious political motivations. As long as Juana was alive and confined, neither her father nor her son would have to face the possibility of her claiming her rights to the throne, or becoming a pawn in the hands of rival noble factions. Descriptions of her life in Tordesillas, conveyed by the few testimonies of those who had access to her, mainly her jailers and a few occasional visitors, paint a bleak picture of abandonment, neglect, and profound physical and emotional suffering. Juana lived in a few dark and poorly furnished rooms in the palace, often in filthy and disorderly conditions. She refused to wash, change her clothes, or take care of her personal appearance. She spent long hours in silence, immersed in deep melancholy, or engaged in strange dialogues with invisible interlocutors. Her only obsessive concern seemed to be the custody of her husband Philip's coffin, which she had had transferred to the nearby convent of Santa Clara, and which she visited frequently, refusing to allow it to be buried permanently. It is said that she ordered the coffin to be opened periodically so that she could gaze upon Felipe's embalmed body in a macabre ritual that fed her grief and madness. Her isolation from the outside world was almost total. Visits were restricted, Her correspondence was censored, and she was kept away from her own children, whom she hardly saw during her long captivity. Her youngest daughter, Catherine, born posthumously during the pilgrimage with Philip's coffin, remained by her side in Tordesillas during her early years, becoming her only companion and the sole object of her affection, but also, according to some, a victim of her mother's emotional instability and neglect. When Catalina was sent to Portugal to marry King John III, Juana sank into even greater despair. The reactions of the court, her family, and the people to the situation of the queen locked up in Tordesillas were a mixture of compassion, fear, and in many cases, cruel indifference. For her jailers, and those who benefited from her incapacitation, her madness was an unquestionable truth that justified her imprisonment. For some of her former supporters, or those who felt pity for her misfortune, Juana was a victim of the ambition of her father and her son, a queen stripped of her crown and her freedom. And for the common people, her figure became a legend, the archetype of the queen mad with love, a tragic and romantic story passed down from generation to generation. Juana's last desperate attempts to save herself, to redeem herself, or to regain her freedom, if there were any that were coherent and determined, proved completely futile. During the revolt of the Comuneros, 1520 to 1521, the rebels tried to obtain her support and legitimacy, recognizing her as the only legitimate queen and asking her to lead the movement. Juana, in a brief moment of apparent lucidity and royal dignity, refused to sign any document that would harm the rights of her son Charles, the emperor, even though he was holding her prisoner. This act of filial loyalty, or perhaps simple inability to make political decisions, sealed her fate once and for all. After the defeat of the Comuneros, her confinement in Tordesillas became even stricter and her isolation deeper. The clock ticking toward her physical death was slowly advancing, but her civil and political death had already occurred many years earlier. Her existence in Tordesillas was a long and painful agony, a living death. Her last years were marked by progressive physical deterioration, a growing indifference to the outside world, and a deep religiosity, often tinged with scruples and superstitious fears. It is said that she completely neglected her personal hygiene, that she barely ate, and that she suffered from various untreated physical ailments. Her jailers, the Marquises of Denia, treated her with a harshness and neglect that bordered on cruelty, although perhaps they were simply following orders from above or reflecting the mentality of the time towards the mentally ill. The queen who had inherited the most powerful kingdoms in Christendom, the woman who had been destined to be empress consort of the Holy Roman Empire, was slowly wasting away in the darkness and abandonment of a Castilian fortress, forgotten by the world and perhaps also by herself. The shadow of the executioner in her case was not that of steel, but of loneliness, misunderstanding, and the cruelty of an imprisonment that lasted for almost half a century, a silent and daily torment that ended up breaking her spirit and consuming her life. The last night, or rather the last days and hours of Juana Raern of Castile, the queen whom history and legend christened with the cruel and perhaps unfair epithet of the Mad, passed in the cold and austere gloom of her chamber in the royal palace of Tordesillas, which had been her gilded prison, or rather her stone cage, for the astonishing and interminable period of 46 years. It was April of the year 1555, and Juana, at the age of 75, a remarkable longevity for the time, and even more so given the harsh conditions of her long and painful captivity, was already on the very threshold of death, her body consumed by old age, untreated illnesses, and a deep and ingrained melancholy that had accompanied her for most of her life. After almost half a century of confinement that had completely cut her off from the world, from the affairs of her own kingdoms, and even more painfully, from the company of most of her children, the former Infanta of Castile and Aragon, Archduchess of Austria, Duchess of Burgundy, and titular queen of a vast empire over which she never actually reigned, was preparing for her final and definitive journey, the one that would finally free her from her earthly prison, and perhaps from the torments of her soul. The account of her final moments, although lacking in intimate details and often colored by the perspective of her jailers or the few clergymen who had access to her, allows us to glimpse a prolonged, lonely, and in a way, deeply pathetic agony. In the months before her death, Juana's physical health, which had never been particularly robust and had been undermined by years of neglect, poor nutrition, and deep sadness, had deteriorated alarmingly. She suffered from edema in her legs, breathing difficulties, generalized weakness that barely allowed her to move, and according to some accounts, sores and ulcers on her skin due to poor hygiene and immobility. Her mental state, always controversial and the subject of debate, seemed to have worsened even further in her final years. Although it is difficult to discern the truth among the often biased reports of her guardians, who had every interest in presenting her as an irredeemable madwoman to justify her confinement, it seems that Joan alternated between periods of deep apathy and silence and others of agitation, confusion, and strange religious delusions. It is said that she refused to receive the sacraments, distrusted the priests who tried to assist her, and uttered incoherent or blasphemous words, which increased the concern of her grandson, King Philip II, who had succeeded his father, Emperor Charles V, to the throne of Spain, for the salvation of her soul. The scene of her death, or rather her slow extinction, must have been heartbreaking. In that cold, bare room in the palace of Tordesillas, surrounded only by a few servants and the Franciscan friars who tried to offer her spiritual comfort, Juana clung to life with surprising tenacity, as if she still had some unfinished business with the world, or as if she feared the divine judgment that awaited her. Her last coherent words, if there were any, have not come down to us with any certainty. Popular tradition, always eager for dramatic and romantic details, has wanted to see in her last breaths invocations to her beloved and deceased husband Philip, whose coffin, although no longer physically at her side in her final years, it had been moved to the royal chapel in Granada by order of her son Charles, continued to occupy a central place in her mind and tormented heart. Other sources, more prosaic and perhaps more reliable, suggest that her last words were of repentance for her sins, asking God for forgiveness and commending her soul to him. The exact moment of her death is believed to have been in the early hours of Good Friday, April 12, 1555, a date laden with profound religious symbolism, which some interpreted as a sign of divine mercy towards a queen who had suffered so much in her life. Her agony, it seems, was long and painful, but her final passage was relatively peaceful. The queen who had inherited the most powerful kingdoms in Christendom, the woman who had been destined to be the center of a universal empire, died thus, in absolute solitude and complete political oblivion, in a dark Castilian fortress, prisoner of her own blood and her own legend. The atmosphere immediately after her death was one of contained relief on the part of her jailers and the court of her grandson Philip II, who saw the disappearance of an uncomfortable figure and a dynastic problem that had gone on for too long. She was given the funeral honors befitting her rank, although without the pomp and splendor that would have been appropriate for a reigning queen. Her body was initially buried in the convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas, alongside her husband Philip, in a simple temporary tomb. It was not until many years later, in 1574, by order of her grandson Philip II, that her mortal remains were solemnly transferred to the Royal Chapel of Granada to rest permanently alongside those of her parents, the Catholic monarchs, and alongside those of her beloved Philip the Handsome, thus fulfilling, at least in part, the wish she had expressed so many years earlier during her wandering pilgrimage with her husband's coffin. The revelation, or rather the confirmation, of Juana la Loca's death definitively closed a complex and often painful chapter in the history of Spain. Her long life, marked by obsessive love, alleged madness, and cruel confinement, remains to this day the subject of fascination, debate, and conflicting interpretations. Was she really mad, or a victim of the ambition and cruelty of the men around her? The mystery largely remains, and her figure, shrouded in the shadows of history and the glare of legend, continues to challenge and move us. The official announcement of the death of Juana Berpernt of Castile, the queen whom history would remember by the nickname the Mad, although predictable given her advanced age and delicate state of health in recent years, did not fail to cause a certain impact and deep reflection in the Spain of her grandson, King Philip II, and in the European courts that still preserved the memory of her tragic and extraordinary story. Although she had been removed from the world for almost half a century, confined to the royal palace of Tordesillas, and stripped of any effective power, her figure continued to represent a complex and often uncomfortable symbol of the dynastic and political upheavals that had marked the transition between the Middle Ages and the modern age in the Iberian Peninsula. The immediate reaction of her grandson, the prudent and austere Philip II, was one of official mourning and formal respect for the memory of his grandmother. He ordered that she be given the funeral honors befitting her rank as Queen of Castile, although without the magnificence and splendor that would have accompanied the death of a reigning monarch. Masses and funeral services were held in her honor in the main churches of the kingdom, and a period of mourning was observed at court. However, it is likely that, in the innermost thoughts of Philip II and his advisors, Juana's death also brought a certain relief, the definitive closure of a problematic chapter, and the disappearance of a figure who, although politically neutralized for decades, continued to represent a certain dynastic anomaly and a constant reminder of the tensions and conflicts that had surrounded the rise of the House of Austria to the throne of Spain. The fate of Juana's body, as we have already mentioned, was initially modest. Her body was embalmed and buried, according to her own wishes or those of her jailers, in the convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas, the same place where she had spent most of her long and painful captivity and where, for many years, she had watched over the coffin of her husband Philip the Handsome with obsessive devotion. There she remained for almost 2 decades, in a simple and relatively forgotten tomb. It was not until 1574 that her grandson, King Philip II, in a gesture that some interpreted as belated filial piety, and others as a way of consolidating the legitimacy of his own dynastic line, ordered the solemn transfer of Juana's mortal remains to the Royal Chapel of Granada. This place, founded by her grandparents, the Catholic monarchs, as the pantheon of the new Spanish monarchy, already housed the tombs of Isabella the Catholic, Ferdinand the Catholic, and Philip the Handsome himself. With Juana's transfer, the main protagonists of that complex and often tragic family and dynastic saga that had marked the birth of modern Spain were thus reunited in death. This symbolic act by Philip II was undoubtedly intended to heal the wounds of the past, reaffirm the continuity and legitimacy of the House of Austria as heir to the Catholic monarchs, and offer Juana a final resting place more in keeping with her royal rank, even if it was after so many years of oblivion and confinement. The immediate political consequences of Juana's death were, in reality, few, since her incapacitation and removal from power had taken place almost half a century earlier. Her death did not alter the course of Spanish politics, which was firmly in the hands of Philip II, nor did it create any kind of power vacuum or succession crisis. However, her death did have an impact on the symbolic sphere and on the construction of historical memory. It allowed the legend of Juana la Loca to begin to take shape, with greater freedom and fewer political constraints, a legend that, as we shall see, would have enormous literary and artistic fortune in the centuries to come. The new questions that arose after her death, or rather those that were reaffirmed and perpetuated, revolved around the true nature of her madness. Was she really mentally ill, the victim of a hereditary defect or a congenital psychological imbalance? Or was her erratic behavior an understandable, albeit extreme, reaction to her husband's infidelities and mistreatment, to the premature loss of her loved ones, and to the excessive ambition and cruelty of the men of her own blood, her father, her husband, her son, who stripped her of her power and freedom to satisfy their own political interests? This debate, which already existed during Juana's lifetime, intensified after her death and has continued to this day, with no definitive consensus among historians and psychiatrists. The lack of reliable and objective medical sources from the period and the obvious political manipulation of her alleged illness make it extremely difficult to make a retrospective diagnosis with any certainty. What does seem clear is that Juana was a woman of extreme sensitivity, overwhelming passions, and emotional fragility that made her particularly vulnerable to the harsh trials imposed on her by fate, and above all to the ambition and unscrupulousness of those around her. Her story is, in this sense, a deeply human tragedy, that of a queen who loved too much, and was loved too much for the power she represented, but not for herself. The death of Juana of Castile in solitude and oblivion in her confinement in Tordesillas, after almost half a century of captivity, was not the end of her story, but the beginning of her complex and often contradictory legend. Her figure, marked by obsessive love, supposed madness, and unspeakable suffering, transcended the limits of historical chronicle to become a powerful cultural myth, a universal archetype that has fascinated and moved entire generations of artists, writers, historians, and the general public, both in Spain and around the world. The legacy of Juana la Loca is, above all, that of a personal tragedy of epic proportions, that of a woman caught between the clutches of a destructive love affair and the relentless demands of reason of state. Her excessive and unrequited love for Philip the Handsome, her pathological jealousy, her macabre pilgrimage with her husband's corpse, and her long and painful confinement made her the symbol par excellence of romantic love, taken to its ultimate and most terrible consequences, the embodiment of the madness of love that so appealed to the romantic sensibility of the 19th century. Countless plays, novels, poems, operas, and films have explored this facet of her personality, often idealizing her as a tragic heroine, victim of a cruel fate, and the incomprehension of a world too prosaic for her passionate soul. However, Juana's legacy is also deeply political. Her story highlighted the tensions and contradictions of a time of transition, when women's power in politics, even that of queen owners, remained extremely limited and vulnerable to male ambitions. Joan was, to a large extent, a victim of the misogyny of her time, which tended to pathologize any expression of independence or strong emotion in women, especially those in positions of power. Her supposed madness was used as a political weapon by her father, her husband, and her son, to strip her of her rights and rule in her name, turning her into a queen in name only, but without real power, a prisoner in her own kingdom. In this sense, she can also be seen as a symbol of women's struggle for autonomy and recognition of their ability to govern, a struggle that, in many ways, continues today. The way she was remembered by subsequent generations was deeply influenced by the political interests of the moment. During the reign of her son, Emperor Charles V, and her grandson, Philip II, attempts were made to maintain a discreet and controlled image of Juana, emphasizing her religious piety and dynastic loyalty, but silencing or minimizing the more scandalous or problematic aspects of her biography. It was in the 19th century, with the rise of Romanticism and liberalism, that her figure was rediscovered and reinterpreted, often with a mixture of morbid fascination, compassion, and feminist vindication. The moral or existential lesson to be learned from the tormented life and sad death of Juana la Loca is perhaps that of the terrible vulnerability of human beings in the face of uncontrolled passions, whether these be love, jealousy, ambition, or the lust for power. Her story reminds us that even those born into the highest ranks and destined for the greatest honors can be dragged into the abyss by the fragility of their own souls or the cruelty of those around them. It also invites us to reflect on the elusive nature of madness, on the boundaries between reason and unreason, and on the ease with which this label can be used to silence, marginalize, or destroy those who are uncomfortable or different. The question that continues to resonate through the centuries, and which may never have a single definitive answer, is whether Juana was truly insane in the clinical sense of the term, or whether her behavior was rather the result of extreme suffering, pathological grief, and a desperate rebellion against a fate that was imposed on her, and that she never fully accepted. Was she an innocent victim of the ambition of the men in her family, or did she also bear some responsibility for her own tragedy? I invite you to share your own thoughts in the comments. What aspect of the life or legacy of Joanna the Mad do you find most relevant or moving? Do you think history has been fair to her, or does she remain a misunderstood figure, mistreated by legend? And if these chronicles of the most shocking and enigmatic endings of royalty fascinate you and invite you to reflect, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like us, and join us on our next journey into the depths of history, where there are always new mysteries to uncover and new lessons to learn. New lessons to learn. New lessons to learn. New lessons to learn. New lessons to learn.